Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. Before we get started, I wanted to run through some housekeeping with you all. So all attendees will be muted during the first portion of the presentation. However, you can use the webinar control panel to submit questions using the questions dialog box. When we transition into the listening session towards the second half of the webinar, we will ask that you use the raise your hand function or submit your name or a question via the questions box, so that it signals our team that you'd like to speak. At that point, we will then read your name aloud and unmute your line. And we will only unmute one line and one speaker at a time to reduce as much background noise as possible. Please note that this will not be the only opportunity to provide responses. You absolutely can still reach out to our team after this webinar. We will also keep the webinar running for 15 minutes after the end so that you can submit questions. Following this webinar today, we will also post the recording and the presentation, along with all of the handouts, on our Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative COVID-19 webpage, which is available at www.indigenousfoodandag.com, and we'll put that information up again towards the end of the webinar. We will also post this webinar recording to our YouTube channel. In addition, we will also follow up with an email to all webinar registrants that include all available resources, handouts, links, this presentation, and the recording, so that you can have access to it afterwards. And with that, I will turn it over to Colby Duran.
Thank you very much, Whitney. Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Colby Duran. I'm the director of the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative. Just wanted to say thank you all very much for joining us for this Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative and Native Farm Bill Coalition webinar update on the COVID-19 crisis that's currently going on. As part of this webinar, we're going to be looking at the impacts and concerns going on throughout Indian country, with a particular focus on food and agriculture and also producers as well. We'll be looking at some of the legislative and administrative actions that have gone on and that are occurring to go on. And then we'll turn it over to you to be able to do a listening session to hear some of the things and concerns that are going on in your communities, in your operations, and to be able to collect some additional information and support, and also be able to try to answer any questions as we can as well. So with that, just to go a little bit into about us, a lot of folks are familiar with our work, but the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative is in its 7th year. It was established at the University of Arkansas School of Law in 2013 by now Vice Chancellor Stacy Leeds and our founding director, Janie Sims-Hip. When Vice Chancellor Leeds became the Vice Chancellor for our Office of Economic Development in 2018, we moved with her. And I think that's actually fit really well with the mission that we were established with our co-founders, to really help support health, wellness, and tribal communities, support tribal food systems, diversified economic development, and traditional food access and cultural food traditions in Indian country. A lot of our work really focuses on sort of the strategic legal analysis, policy analysis, and providing educational resources that are all aimed at empowering Indian country. We like to kind of sum up what we do by saying it's sort of putting the tribal sovereignty and food sovereignty and really being able to focus on that. We have a lot of different projects. We are the research partner in the Native Farm Bill Coalition. We'll be talking about some of the Native Farm Bill Coalition work going forward. We have our Scaling Up project, where we work with tribal governments and tribal food business on scaling up their food businesses. We do work supporting tribal self-governance in food and agriculture at USDA. And we also do work as the Native Outreach Center for produce safety under FDA as the outreach center for that. So as there have been so many different questions, sort of particularly about food safe, as folks are going to grocery stores, going to different markets, trying to source food items. I think some questions that folks have are sort of, what are some of the impacts that COVID-19 is having on food operations and also the food that they're purchasing as consumers? So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our program and policy specialist, Josiah Griffin, to talk about some of the food safety related concerns regarding COVID-19. Josiah, please take it away.
Thank you, Colby. So as Colby mentioned, my name is Josiah Griffin, and I am a program and policy specialist with the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative. I am Native Hawaiian and one of 4 staff on our team that is certified in the Produce Safety Alliance grower trainings. So as we look at food safety risks related to COVID-19, one of the initial questions that many people start to ask is, well, is COVID-19 a food safety risk at all? And as we're looking at that question, I think that we really split that into 2 different parts. The first is novel coronavirus, or what we call COVID-19, a foodborne illness? And research and what FDA has indicated is that there is no evidence that COVID-19 is transmitted through food, unlike other foodborne illnesses that you might be familiar with, like the norovirus or E. coli, or E. coli. The second part of this question is, can COVID-19 be transmitted through food packaging? And generally speaking, there is a possibility for COVID-19 to remain on food contact surfaces for a certain period of time, and I'll get into that in just a second. But by the time COVID-19 reaches, or by the time food packaging reaches conventional grocery stores as we think about them today, it's taken at least a couple days to a week or so to actually get to that store. So the likelihood of COVID-19 remaining on that food packaging surface is highly minimal. Now, as we're looking at local foods, there is also the possibility to mitigate some of these risks by practicing common food safety techniques that you might be familiar with if you've listened to any one of the webinars that we've done at nativeFoodSafety.org. So next slide, please. So as we look at the shelf life, so to speak, of COVID-19, it varies largely by the type of product that you're working with. Based on research that was conducted by the New England Journal of Medicine, we understand that COVID-19 has a shelf life of about 24 hours or 1 day on cardboard, 72 hours on plastic surfaces, and 96 hours on glass. These are 3 of the primary food packaging types or product types that we are generally accustomed to. And so it may be helpful to adjust your operation accordingly. But what we also know about COVID-19 is that it follows throughout this process an exponential decay model. So as you work through the timing, it's just something to keep in mind moving forward. So next slide, please. So many jurisdictions across the country have started to take a look at how the people and households in that jurisdiction, whether that be tribal, federal, state, or local, should engage or respond with their communities. Many jurisdictions are entering into stay-at-home orders or hunker-down orders, depending on what they're called here. The important thing to consider is that especially for food and agriculture operations, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Cybersecurity, and Infrastructure Security Agency issued a memorandum on March 19th, 2020 for identifying the essential critical infrastructure workers during COVID-19 response. And I won't read the entirety of all of the workers and types of workers that are listed in this memorandum. It's on page 6. If you'd like to get the full scope. But it's fairly broad and it includes everyone from farm workers and growers to manufacturers and suppliers, processors. It also includes forestry and timber and animal and veterinary service providers. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that if you're interested in learning more. So next slide, please. So we understand that people across the food and agriculture industry can continue to go to work and maintain the robust and vibrant food infrastructure that we are familiar with today. And we are very grateful for all of the work that they've done and they continue to do to make sure that all of us have food on the table across the country and that there is a consistent food supply access. So as you're looking at responding to COVID-19 in your operation, there are some things that you might want to keep in mind to make sure that you are doing as much as you can to mitigate COVID-19 risks. The first, as many people are familiar with already, is social distancing, where common instruction is to make sure that staff and customers are kept at least 6 feet of distance apart from each other. It may be helpful to notify staff and customers through signs or by calling people in advance to let them know what the expectations are when they visit your operation. It may be necessary to rotate your schedule if maintaining 6 feet apart from each other isn't possible, so that there is more of a gap between when workers or vendors come in. Many companies and organizations across the country are also reserving early visiting hours for tribal elders and other people who are at higher risk of contracting COVID-19. It's always important to wash your hands anytime that you touch your face, anytime that you touch a contaminated or dirty surface, and as regularly as possible for at least 20 seconds, making sure that you clean not only your hands, but clean and sanitize frequently used surfaces with food grade products. It's important whether you are touching or cleaning the food contact surfaces or the produce itself, to always make sure that it's food grade so that you're not introducing other potential food safety risks. Always avoid touching your face, especially as you are interacting with people or the environment. It may be possible to have masks available so that people aren't touching their face directly. Workers and customers who are sick should not visit the operation and should practice home isolation. The Center for Disease Control has some additional guidance there. And as you're looking at practicing social distance models, you may need to adopt alternative options for either how people place their orders, whether that be online or in advance over the phone, or through a drive-through pickup model, which some farmers markets are starting to adopt. And for that, I'd like to turn it back to Colby.
Great. Thank you so much, Josiah, for that very thorough and in-depth look at some of the different concerns and things for producers and businesses to be considering for this during that time. Just I know this has come up. These slides will be shared with everybody afterwards as well. So if you are taking notes, you will have these slides available and sent out to everybody. The next thing we want to go into is some of the conversations that have gone around some of the legislative and administrative responses to the COVID-19 crisis. Some of our work at the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative, we operate as the research partner in the Native Farm Bill Coalition. And the Native Farm Bill Coalition has been working with many different tribal leaders, tribal organizations, since this has kind of been identified, to be able to start to address some of the many different issues that are kind of occurring and provide some emergency support. You know, some of this effort started very early with the folks at Native American Finance Officers Association, National Indian Health Board, the National Congress of American Indians, the National Council on Urban Indian Health, United South and Eastern Tribes, the National Indian Education Association, American Indian Higher Education Consortium, Tribal Self-Governance and Education Organization, and also so many others as well too. As folks are familiar, the Native Farm Bill Coalition has about 170 tribes represented in it, and also 15 intertribal organizations that have joined on. We also have our allied organizations who we've been coordinating with, particularly looking at some of the issues around nutrition and working with Mazone, a Jewish response to hunger on that, and also coordinating with the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, particularly on some of the impacts to producers as well. And so this and the coordination with the work of the folks at Intertribal Agriculture Council and their team as well, we've kind of gone into some of the different, different asks and try to have some ideas that have gone forward. But because there's so many different things that have gone on, we just want to kind of lay out where things have been, where things have gone, and kind of where things are going. So folks are probably familiar, there have been 3 bills that have passed Congress in response to COVID-19 throughout the month of March. We'll talk briefly about each one of those and have this particular focus on Bill 3, which has a substantial number of tribal inclusions and also some additional support for for both the food distribution program on Indian reservations, as well as some other USDA programs. There is the potential for at least one more bill, which is like either COVID-19 Bill 4, some folks are maybe calling it C4, and there might be an opportunity for a fifth bill as well too. And from the things that folks are reporting, the fourth bill will probably have a larger infrastructure, water access, and those type of issues focus. There was a national emergency presidential proclamation made on March 13th. Also, the Office of Management and Budget at the executive office of the president has issued some memoranda. We'll talk about those and what the impacts that means for agencies implementing that information. And then also we'll be looking at how the federal agencies are implementing legislation and also what their administrative responses are like, and then start to address what some of the additional support for Indian country and food and agriculture looks like going forward. The first bill that was passed very early on in this process was basically a pure appropriations bill that included about $8.3 billion. A lot of it was focused on medical countermeasures funding to FDA, $1 billion for small business producers and nonprofits through the FBA support, and then $950 million for the Center for Disease Control, which also included $475 million specifically for tribes in that as well. There's also $40 million specific to tribal organizations, urban Indian health organizations, as well as health service organizations that are providers to tribes as well. We know that the CDC has been working to get out that information and get out that money. So there are some additional resources for that. The folks at NCI have put together a good breakdown of what specifically is in this bill. There's a link to the CDC website, which has some of the information regarding the COVID-19 response and how to access these dollars. And then there's a letter from the National Indian Health Board outlining some important issues for consideration for this as that's being implemented. For the second bill that was passed is just a little over $3 billion package plus. It included $500 million for the WIC program, $400 million for the Emergency Food Assistance Program. It allows eligibility for households that have SNAP eligibility for households that have students who receive free and reduced National School Lunch Program benefits. Included an additional $64 million to the Indian Health Service, and also had the ability for USDA to grant waivers to states and eligible school lunch providers to provide food services to students at this time as schools are being closed. There is one tribal specific component in that, and that is $10 million that specifically goes towards the Older American Act and home delivery of food for American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian elders. Again, there's a full breakdown of that available on NCI's website, and that link is below and will be shared after the webinar. The third bill, which had a substantial amount of tribal input and an incredible amount of coordination between tribal leadership, tribal organizations, and tribal representatives, ended up being about a $2.2 trillion bill. And I think is the largest spending effort that Congress has ever passed it by almost a factor of 25. Some of the highlights in this that have been covered by many of the tribal organizations already that have strong resources on it, including NCAI, NAFO, and NAHB, but just to go over what some of the top line things are, about $8 billion for a tribal-specific stabilization set aside in response to the COVID-19 crisis to help support tribal governments at this time. $453 million for the Bureau of Indian Affairs to support programs and also assistance to tribal governments. About $1 billion plus for the Indian Health Service is also included in that as well. There's also some nutrition-specific components in there as well, including $100 million for the food distribution program on Indian reservations, or the FDPIR program. 50 of that is set aside for food purchases, and the additional 50 is set aside for facility improvements and equipment upgrades. And we'll be going into detail about what that means and what that means also for implementation. There was also an additional $20 million for Native American nutrition grants under the Older Americans Act. The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, which is an incredibly important program, also received baseline funding. This doesn't represent an increase to the funding that it normally receives. We know that a lot of folks in the anti-hunger world, like our friends at Mazone and also the folks at FRAC, are advocating for a 15% increase in Bill 4. So I think that's something for folks to be able to look out for, as we know those numbers are going to increase with folks who need to rely on those benefits. And then there was also $8 billion included for child nutrition programs. There was also some USDA specific support included in this bill. About $9.5 billion in disaster funding, which is specifically allocated for livestock and ranchers, for dairy, fruit, and vegetable growers and other local producers. An important distinction, as a lot of times that money goes into a pot and so it's kind of dispersed out. So they wanted to ensure that there was a specific set aside for those type of producers who may not have access to some of the other funding that USDA provides. There was also a $14 billion to bolster the Commodity Credit Corporation, which is an important safety net that USDA has. There was $100 million for the Reconnect Broadband program, and then also $25 million provided in telemedicine and funding. The Native Farm Bill Coalition worked with the NCAI, National Indian Health Board, NCUI, USIT, NAA, AHEC, Tribal Self-Governance, and of course with our friends at Intertribal Agriculture Council, and sent a letter to USDA last night regarding implementation of Bill 3, focused on FDPIR implementation and also some of the USDA specific implementation. That handout is available in the handouts drop-down menu on the right-hand side of your screen, so you can download that. But to go into some of the very specifics regarding particularly FDPIR and the implementation and what that means and the impacts for it, I'd like to turn it over to our research director and staff attorney, Erin Parker. Erin, please take it away.
All right, Colby, thank you so much. Thank you for walking through all of those numbers and kind of setting us up to talk a little bit about FDPIR and what this latest bill, the CARES Act specifically, has in store for FDPIR and how we can look at USDA implementation on that. So if you want to go to the next slide, I will get started. I'm going to talk a little bit first about just what FDPIR is in general, the kinds of food that FDPIR provides, and sort of who FDPIR is serving right now and the numbers of people we're seeing FDPIR serve right now, just to kind of set a baseline for some of the information that I'm going to share about what's happening now and how the food distribution program on Indian reservations, or FDPIR, or some people know it as CMODS, is being able to serve families across Indian country during this crisis to make sure that they have food on the table now and going forward. So FDPIR, just for anybody who doesn't know, is a federal nutrition assistance program. It's administered at the federal level by USDA and locally on the ground by 112 Indian tribal organizations, or ITOs, and 3 state agencies. It serves around 90,000 people every single month across 276 tribes in Indian country and in Oklahoma. Food packages are provided to folks who are participating in FDPIR. There are a lot of different kinds of foods that are in those food packages. You have a lot of shelf-stable items, which are obviously going to continue to be really popular with folks right now as people are looking forward to how they're going to continue to make sure that they have food in their pantries going forward during this crisis. That includes grains and pasta, canned fruits and vegetables, flour, and those kinds of items, as well as some frozen foods, frozen vegetables and fruit, frozen meats, and some fresh fruits and vegetables. Fresh fruits and vegetables have been a part of the FDPIR food package regularly since 2010, and those continue to be an important part of the food package today, as well as several different kinds of traditional foods that are available to participants. That's bison, wild rice, salmon, blue cornmeal, catfish, and lamb or mutton. All of those things are available right now in the FDPIR food package. FDPIR is also one of the 2 places in the 2018 Farm Bill where 638 Tribal Self-Governance Authority was extended to USDA programs for the first time. Here in FDPIR, there's a demonstration project for ITOs to do food purchasing directly through 638 self-determination contracts. There's $3 million out there that's been appropriated for that right now, and we'll come back to that later as we talk about some of the implementation recommendations for USDA under the CARES Act. So keep that in the back of your mind, but we can go to the next slide now. The next slide's got just a little bit of information about who participates in FDPIR. So as you can see here, we've got 42% of FDPIR households have an elder in the household, someone over the age of 60. About a third of FDPIR households we know have a child who's under the age of 18 in the household. There are over 50% of FDPIR participants who do have some kind of income typically, but right now we know as businesses are closing across the country, that is going to continue. That number is going to continue probably to go down. That's not the case. People are not going to have access to income, making these programs that provide food access all the more critical during this crisis. We can go to the next slide too and talk about some of the COVID-19 impacts on the FDPIR program. So IFAI works really closely with the National Association of FDPIR. That's the National Association of all of the ITOs across the country that run and manage FDPIR every single day for those 276 tribes that are participating in the FDPIR program. And NAFDPIR, obviously, as they are ITO managers, has been looking very closely at what's going on across the country during this crisis. And they've been able to do some surveys of their ITOs just to kind of get some preliminary data about what's happening out there across the country and what kind of participation we're seeing in FDPIR right now. So NAFDPIR survey data indicates right now there's an 11% average increase across ITOs that reported into that survey in participation. So that's already an immediate 11% bump, and that's really just since the World Health Organization officially declared that this outbreak was a pandemic. And I know it probably feels like to everybody that time has passed very slowly in the last couple of weeks, and you feel like you've lived maybe a couple of years in the last couple of weeks, but it really only has been a couple of weeks that we've seen this already average 11% increase at ITOs. We've also seen at some particular sites, they're reporting up to a 50% increase just in that first week that this was declared a pandemic. So those things are going to continue to deplete. We know warehouse stock across the country at individual ITOs, necessitating some more food purchasing dollars, hopefully from USDA, to be able to continue to stock those warehouses. And I'll talk about that in a little bit when we get to the CARES Act. Some of the other concerns that NAFDPIR had and things that they were seeing on the ground is that the take rates of food at FDPIR sites are increasing. So I'll explain a little bit about that for anybody who's unfamiliar with FDPIR food packaging and how that works. So food package size for FDPIR is determined by your household size, and you get different numbers of different items and different categories of foods, whether that's frozen meat or canned meat, fresh vegetables, what have you. Everybody gets a different amount based on household size. There are also choices that people can make within those categories as well when they're getting their food packages, but participants are not required to take a full package when they come to pick up that food package, or if they have it delivered. They can take what they need, and many people, typically who are participating at sites, may just take what they need when they arrive. But with this crisis, people are seeing on the ground, they're taking that full package as much as they are allowed, like maxing out that food package, because they are concerned that food availability isn't going to be there long term. A lot of folks in rural areas are seeing grocery stores being really slow to restock. So people who may be eligible for SNAP and FDPIR, for example, you can't do those in the same month. So people are choosing FDPIR over SNAP right now because they're having that trouble really seeing any kind of benefit from SNAP benefits right now if they're not able to actually find that food that they need at the grocery store. We're seeing increased participation in FDPIR because of that. There's also been some supply chain and ordering issues that ITOs have seen, both from the two national warehouses that supply the shelf-stable foods and the frozen foods for the package, and for some of the produce ordering. So fresh fruits and vegetables come to FDPIR differently from the shelf-stable and frozen goods that are in the food package. And it isn't actually the food, the produce availability that's the problem that we're seeing at the moment. The problem that we're seeing right now is that literally it's the delivery vehicles that are the problem. Not everything that comes on a delivery truck to every site is for that one site. That's, a delivery company will pack as much produce into the truck as they can, and then on their route, they stop along the way and deliver to different restaurants and FDPIR sites as well. So what they're seeing right now is restaurants and stores are closing in places, especially in places that are more rural, where there aren't a lot of businesses to begin with. As those restaurants close, people are not filling those delivery trucks, and routes are being canceled in some places. So we have seen that happening as well. That isn't, and by the way, like, none of this is every single site across the country, right? Like, this is very every single site is going to have a different availability because everybody's going to have a different delivery route and access to to fresh fruits and vegetables from different vendors. So just know that that may not apply every single place across the board, but that is a trend that we have seen. Also, as ITOs are seeing more participants, they're looking at expanding their stock. The problem there has been with many ITOs, they don't necessarily always have the additional storage space to physically store that food long term, and that's especially true for items that need cold or frozen storage, like those frozen fruits and vegetables, frozen meats, and fresh fruits and vegetables as well. I think we can go to the next. Oh, sorry, one more thing. ITOs are eligible to be disaster feeding sites for USDA as well, and they can use their inventory that's in their warehouses right now to be able to do that once they've been approved by FNS to do so, and they can get reimbursed for those foods. But this is not, this is a really good option for families who may need extra help right now because they've lost some income, but maybe they don't necessarily qualify for FDPIR. So if your ITO is running that USDA Foods Disaster Assistance, you may have that available as well. However, that does put an additional strain on FDPIR warehouse inventory to serve people right now and then wait for deliveries of food to replenish that stock. You want to go to the next slide? Got a little more data to expand on some of those concerns. And again, this is all from FDPIR surveys of member ITOs, just to be able to better assess kind of some of the needs that they're seeing right now. So of ITOs reporting, we're seeing take rates increasing up to 80% of sites who reported into the survey indicated that their take rates of those foods across the board was increasing. Part of FDPIR inventory management that ITOs do is to keep between 1 and 3 months of stock in warehouses, and most ITOs that have reported in, about 68%, have reported that they had just about a month in inventory, and they're looking to increase that right now as they're seeing all that increased participation across the country. And again, sometimes that may not be possible because the infrastructure may not be there to support that additional storage of food, especially if it's cold or frozen storage. 66% of the ITOs checking in have reported that they are out of products in some category, and about 43% said that they were out of certain fresh fruits and vegetables. When those fresh fruits and vegetable supplies do start to diminish, that does increase the take rates of canned fruits and vegetables, so that's another impact to stock as well. And just in the last couple of weeks, we know at least 600 new households were certified by ITOs across the country. And that's just households, that's not numbers of people. The number of people in those households is going to vary. Could be one person, could be several people. So that will increase, or rather that will decrease the amount of stock that individual ITOs have in their warehouse. It just makes it really important to make sure that we're keeping the ability and availability of supplies to be able to restock those warehouses right now. We can go to the next slide. So some of the crisis responses that FDPIR has been able to undertake has also sort of increased some administrative costs for FDPIR ITOs as well. So you can see sites are moving to try to do more social distancing. The way that a lot of sites are doing that is to go to a drive-up model of service. Josiah mentioned that is something that people might do in food industries to make sure that we're facilitating that social distance and reducing contact between people who are in a store, in a grocery store environment, and customers. Same here in FDPIR. A lot of sites are shifting to that drive-up service model where participants arrive, and instead of going into a warehouse or going into a storefront model, they're picking up a box outside, like in their vehicle. But that means that there's extra staff time needed to pack all those boxes, extra boxes and bags to like actually put together all those food packages for the ITOs. And those are extra administrative costs as well. We're also seeing FDPIR sites move to some additional deliveries. I know of some sites that are calling participants to see if they need a home delivery because they may need to self-isolate because they're high risk for COVID-19. There are plenty of folks in FDPIR who don't have access necessarily to vehicles, and as families continue to be impacted by business closures and not necessarily have the ability to jump in a car and come to a FDPIR site, increased deliveries is something that some of the ITOs are looking into as well, to be able to make sure that people still have that food to continue feeding themselves and their families during this time. But that means increased fuel costs for the ITO as well to be able to make those deliveries, especially for ITOs that have a really big service area across long distances. And finally, additional food ordering, just as we've as I've gone over, like there's a lot of increased participation and a lot of increased take rates, and that depletes warehouse stock at ITOs. So ITOs are looking to put in additional food orders to be able to make sure that they've got enough stock on their shelves to keep serving their community members. So all of those things are things that are kind of contributing to some increased need for administrative dollars, infrastructure dollars, and food dollars for FDPIR. Unfortunately, the CARES Act, as Colby mentioned, does have some relief for FDPIR. So we can go to the next slide and talk a little bit about what that is and what it means. As Colby mentioned, there's $100 million for the food distribution program on Indian reservations in the CARES Act. That's the third bill that was just passed by Congress in late March. So the CARES Act has $50 million in it for additional food purchasing for FDPIR and $50 million in it for, I call it infrastructure. The specific language in the bill is facility improvements and equipment. So that's what's in there for FDPIR, and that infrastructure dollars in particular is a really big help to provide those facility improvements and equipment upgrades that are going to enable ITOs to maintain the additional food stock that they're seeing a need for right now, and ultimately that provides more storage space long term as well going forward for the program. Those funds are made available until the end of fiscal year 21, so that's September 30th, 2021 is how long those funds are available. But I will say they must be used for the crisis. The language in the bill is pretty clear: prevent, prepare for, and respond to coronavirus is the language in the bill when it discusses that money being appropriated. So ideally, this means that those funds are expended by USDA as soon as possible, since we are in the middle of this crisis right now, and we know some of the projections that we've seen put it going for several more months at least. So being able to use that money to support people who are needing to access FDPIR right now is going to be pretty important. And that's one of the recommendations that's in the letter that Colby mentioned that was sent forward to USDA from some stakeholders, Native Farm Bill Coalition, and other groups that are working on these issues. And again, you can download that in the handouts file, but we've got a couple more things that were recommended in that letter, and I wanted to go over those as well. So we've got one more slide we can go to. So as USDA is looking to implement that, specifically the FDPIR funding that was allocated for FDPIR in the CARES Act. There's a couple of things that are in that letter that Colby mentioned, went to USDA, that I wanted to pull out and talk about a little bit. So some recommendations from Native Farm Bill Coalition and FDPIR on how this could be implemented as soon as possible by USDA to help FDPIR feed families across Indian country during this crisis include administrative flexibility, basically to the max extent possible under existing law and the new OMB guidance that I think Blake on our team is going to go over with you in a little bit, to be able to do extended certification periods for FDPIR participants. I think right now the way that that things work, people who apply for FDPIR can be certified for up to 12 months. That means they can remain on the program without having to recertify with their ITO for up to 12 months. If there's administrative flexibility that could make sure that continues throughout this crisis. Verification of new participants, being able to use new models to be able to do that either over the phone or reducing paperwork to make sure that people have that opportunity to maintain social distancing and reduce the spread of this virus is going to be really important. Any kind of flexibility that can be offered in supporting FDPIR ITOs and delivering food to people who need to self-isolate, pre-packing food service options, locating supplies to be able to do that, like literally just the boxes to be able to pre-pack those food service options. Just the maximum extent that USDA can allow that administrative flexibility would be very helpful for FDPIR right now. To make FDPIR a priority in funding as well, and expediting the budget processes that get those funds under CARES out to sites as soon as possible, especially those infrastructure funds, so those improvements can go ahead and get started and people can start sourcing new equipment. If there's new coolers that they can purchase to store additional frozen items or to cool fresh fruits and vegetables that they're being able to order and have it at their sites so that they can continue to provide that good service to people across Indian country. In addition to the food being purchasing, just making sure that food that is purchased for FDPIR goes to the FDPIR programs. That's something that ITOs or that FDPIR has been concerned about in the past and has already brought up with USDA as well in recent conversations. In addition to that, making sure that those CARES funds are expended quickly. As I mentioned, they are appropriated to respond and prepare for this crisis. They're available till the end of 2021 fiscal year, but we know this crisis is ongoing right now, and USDA's preference and guidance in the past has usually been to spend older money first. So that would mean money that's already been obligated under typical appropriation cycles. But obviously, we want USDA to spend this money responsibly, not hold on to money and have it expire, but the funds that were appropriated under CARES are tied to helping with this crisis. So they really need to be spent, right now while this crisis is happening and ongoing through the end of fiscal year 2021 to make sure that those improvements at facilities happen and that additional food is purchased to cover the additional participation that we're seeing. A really big one is also to allow those funds to cover administrative costs and for USDA to waive the non-federal cost share requirement that's in FDPIR right now. This is a really big one because a lot of tribal nations we know are struggling right now to cover costs like that, while tribally owned businesses have had to close and those revenue streams are not are not fruitful right now. So reducing that non-federal cost share, which right now is 20% of program operations currently, to 0% for the duration of this crisis would be really crucial for tribal nations continuing to operate FDPIR. And I said we would get back to 638, and I wasn't kidding. We have another big recommendation here is to have USDA immediately open up that 638 process that was put into the 2018 Farm Bill. USDA was in the middle of kind of figuring out what that application process looked like when this crisis developed. So the big recommendation here is just to open that process up ASAP, take into account the comments that USDA has already received from tribal leaders on that process, from tribal nations in their requests for comments that they, or excuse me, request for information that they had closed at the end of February. They got, I think, about 16 letters from tribal nations on that. So they have some good feedback about what that process should look like. So the recommendation was just to approve tribal nations for purchasing, open up that application immediately so that tribes can get more locally produced food into the FDPIR program very quickly through that 638 process. Related to that, more administrative flexibility here to purchase local right now for FDPIR, especially for things like fresh fruits and vegetables, for traditional foods, where we know deliveries may be disrupted, but there are those local markets and local producers who are available and want markets for their products right now, as they're seeing restaurants close and other businesses close that may have represented revenue streams that they're really lacking right now. So that's a good economic support as well as a support for this program. That administrative flexibility to do local purchasing would be really important. And finally, just keeping the lines of communication open and continuing to do weekly operations calls for ITOs with USDA, and also have weekly check-in calls between tribal leaders and FDPIR and USDA FNS. And I will say with that, USDA has been good about continuing those calls and making sure that they are available to tribal leaders and FDPIR and ITOs who have any problems that have arisen related to this or really anything else. So I would like to, before I turn it back over to Colby, just briefly thank USDA, especially the Office of Tribal Relations team, their director, Diane Kulo, and Jeff Harris on their team for being so willing and ready to solve problems during this crisis. And thanks as well to the FNS team that's led by Administrator Pam Miller for keeping in close contact with FDPIR and tribal leaders. And I would really encourage folks if you're having issues accessing programs or having issues with FDPIR to reach out to the OTR team. They're in there at USDA 100% dedicated to solving problems for tribal nations. So I would definitely recommend that you reach out to them, as well as letting us know. You can reach out to me anytime, especially about things that are related to FDPIR, and I will do my best to get you an answer and help solve problems. So that is the FDPIR update, I believe. So with that, I will turn it back over to you, Colby.
Great. Thank you so much, Erin, for that incredibly strong and thorough breakdown of the funding and implementation things to consider going forward. I think one of the things you're able to see through this is that there has been an incredibly strong process and a lot of folks working on some of the different issues and components of this. And just before we get on to our next session, I think I just want to say a quick thank you, particularly to the folks that have been working on these issues from the tribal leadership and tribal orgs and tribal advocates components, and also want to say, with the Strong Earth and Native Farm Bill Coalition, a thank you to the Shakopee, Metawakan, and Sioux community who began and led the efforts establishing the Native Farm Bill Coalition in 2017, along with our friends and partners at the Intertribal Agriculture Council and the National Congress of American Indians, and also the over 170 tribes and 15 tribal organizations and allies that have joined on. All of those efforts and coordinations and working together on this has led to some very important inclusions and programs and funding. But as we can see from this and the strong breakdown, that there is a lot more to be able to do to ensure that both the funding and the programs get to folks that need it on the ground. One thing I do want to mention in this is that in the CARES Act, and thank you, Buck Jones from the Columbia River Intertribal Fishery Commission for mentioning this, there is $300 million for fisheries with specific inclusion for tribal fisheries and fishers. So that's an important component for folks that are fishers that need assistance during this time. So that's another program that can help support those folks as well. So thank you, Buck, for mentioning that. As we mentioned, there is a strong Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, memorandums that have been released that are directing agencies to how they should be going forward with their programming and also implementation and what they need to be looking at. Next up, I'd like to have our policy officer and staff attorney, Blake Jackson, who's done a thorough look into this, talk about what the OMB guidances are, what that means, and then also go into some of the different other resources that USDA has available for folks at this time. So Blake, please take it away.
Thank you, Colby. Just to kind of expand a little bit upon what you talked about, we talked about the budget cycle and how different money has been earmarked for certain programs and purposes under the CARES Act. And now that we are in the process of seeing where those buckets fall, the Office of Management and Budgets within the Executive Office of the President and kind of serves as the gatekeeper for how and when this money is distributed by the federal agencies. And so in doing this, there's been some recognition that obviously we're in a time that resources are kind of constrained and people are going to need some additional flexibility in terms of doing this. So the Deputy Director of Management has sent 2 different memoranda out to agency heads, executive departments and agencies, kind of detailing where there's some flexibility for programming that can be, things that can be waived, things that can be suspended, things that can be, extended as far as deadlines go. So I'm going to go through these 2 memoranda. 2 things that I will point out, first of all, though, in your handouts for this presentation over on the little small window, these 2 memoranda are detailed as OMB M2011 and OMB M2017, but they're also going to be hyperlinked in this presentation up at the top for each one to get the hard copy online as well. So the first of these memoranda that we're going to go to is M2011, Administrative Relief for Recipients and Applicants of Federal Financial Assistance directly impacted by the novel coronavirus, COVID-19. And this was drafted, it's a little more narrow in scope than the subsequent one, but it allows federal agencies to grant class exceptions in instances where the agency has determined that the purpose of the federal award is to support the continued research and services necessary to carry out the emergency response related to COVID-19. So it's pretty tightly worded in terms of being able to continue if your research and services are necessary to carry out emergency response related to COVID-19. So that's specifically dealing with, when I talk about awards, we're talking about grants and cooperative agreements from federal agencies to different grantees. So in doing that, there's about 10 different things that the memorandum has called out. The first is the flexibility for SAM registration and recertification of applicants. The system of award management is something that, as a grantee or someone who's applying for a federal award, that you typically have to go in and apply for and be certified through. And in this directive, agencies can relax the requirement for active SAM registration at the time of application in order to more expeditiously issue funding. The requirements in the Federal Register still continue to apply, but that's the first thing that we can see. Another thing that we see also in Part 2 is a waiver for notice of funding of opportunities publication. So awarding agencies can publish NOFOs for less than 30 days without separately justifying shortening the time frame for each NOFO. So this allows agencies to put out funding opportunities a little bit more expeditiously without going through a lot of the administrative red tape, because those have to go out with federal funding announcements. Another thing that we see is pre-award cost. Agencies can allow pre-award costs, so that costs that are incurred pre-award or prior to receiving a grant. If these costs are incurred from January 20th, 2020 through the public health emergency period and prior to the effective date of a federal award. The third thing we see, or excuse me, the fourth thing that we see is no cost extensions on expiring awards. So if you have a grant or a cooperative agreement that is active as of March 31st, so yesterday, and is scheduled to expire up to prior or up to December 31st of 2020, so the end of this year, the agency is allowed to automatically at no cost extend this for a period of 12 months. And this is to ensure that you have time to do assessments, and the resumption of many individual projects, and a report on program progress and financial status to agency staff. The project-specific financial and performance reports are due 90 days following the date of the extension. So please keep in mind that you do have those following reports that are due 90 days thereafter. Another thing we see is abbreviated non-competitive continuation requests. So for non-competitive continuation requests scheduled to come in after April 1st to December 31st from projects with planned future support, awarding agencies may accept a brief statement from grantee organizations to verify that they are in a position to resume or restore their projects and accept a planned continuation award. So you get a little bit more of a relaxed requirement on these continuation requests. Agencies will need to continue to extend this approach on subsequent continuation award start dates, as grantee organizations have the opportunity to assess the situation. Another thing that we see is that if you are a recipient of a grant, and your institution allows you to charge salaries and benefits to active federal awards consistent with your organization's policies, you may also enter into an agreement with the agency for other costs, including those necessary to resume activities supported by the award. Under this guidance, federal agencies may also evaluate the recipient's ability to project activity in the future and appropriateness of future funding as done under normal circumstances based on subsequent progress reports and other communications with recipient organizations and entities. Another thing that we see on Part 7 is that a waiver of prior approval requirements. Agencies are allowed to waive these as necessary to effectively address the response. All costs charged to federal awards must be consistent with the policy guidelines for the award, except as were specified under OMB guidance. And under a lot of federal awards, we also see procurement requirements where you have to source within a certain geographical preference regarding small and minority businesses, women's business enterprises, and labor surplus area firms. These are allowed to be suspended or waived, during this period as well by awarding agencies. We also have an extension of financial and other reporting. So if you have a grant or a cooperative agreement that has a financial or some sort of other report due, the agency may give you a 3-month extension beyond the normal due date. And if the agency allows you to have that delay, you will still be allowed to draw upon your federal funds without the timely submission of these reports, but the reports must be submitted at the end of the postponed period. Also at the end, you have your single audit submission. Awarding agencies should allow grantee recipients to delay the completion and submission of single audit awards as specified under federal regulations 12 months beyond the normal due date. The delayed completion and submission will qualify the grantee as a low-risk auditee under the criteria of federal law. So that's our first set of guidance under the OMB guidelines, and this was more of the narrowly tailored one. The next one we're going to talk about is M20-17, and it's a little bit more expansive in scope to address recipients affected by the loss of operational capacity and increased costs due to the COVID-19 virus. So the last time, we talked about the previous memoranda kind of dealt with those whose award is aimed at supporting the continued research and services necessary to carry out their emergency response related to COVID-19. This one kind of opens the door a little bit more for a lot more stakeholders and to have kind of similar flexibilities in there. So the first thing we see again is the flexibility with SAM registration. Awarding agencies can again relax this requirement for registration and re-registration. If you have a SAM registration that it is active now and expiring before May 16th, 2020, you're afforded a one-time extension of 60 days. Again, flexibility with application dates. Awarding agencies may give flexibility with regard to the submission of completing awards in response to specific announcements, as well as unsolicited applications. Agencies should list specific guidance on their websites or provide a point of contact for the agency program official. The next that we have is for grants and cooperative agreements. We see again a waiver of notice for the NOFO publication for opportunities lasting less than 30 days. Again, we also see no cost extension showing up. If your award was active as of March 31st and scheduled to expire December 31st, 2020, the agencies are authorized to give you a no cost extension for a period of 12 months. Again, project specific and performance results will be due 90 days following the date of the end date of the extension. So again, a lot of flexibility there that we're seeing similarly. We have again the same requirements with abbreviated non-competitive continuation requests. Again, kind of you get to submit the report that you're in a position to resume or restore the project activities and accept a planned continuation award. We also see flexibility with regard to the allowability of salaries and other project activities. Awarding agencies should allow other costs to be charged to federal awards as necessary to resume activity supported by the award, if it's consistent with applicable federal cost principles and the benefit to the project. Something that we see a lot more flexibility here, and I know that we've dealt with this in a lot of aspects, and we've even had to deal with this internally within our organization, is canceled travel. You know, we have a lot of conferences that have gone on and a lot of events that have both been either canceled at the entity side of things, or different institutions and organizations have, you know, had some sort of travel halt that's been put on. So the thing here is that number 7 is cost not normally chargeable to awards. You can actually use grant funding to pay for travel cancellations, and also you can pause funding. Awarding agencies must advise recipients that they should not assume additional funds will be available should the charging of cancellation or events or other fees result in a shortage of funds to eventually carry out the event or the travel. So again, you know, you can't assume that that money is going to come back to you on the back end, but you do have to have the appropriate records. So that's kind of one thing to keep in mind as far as things go. You can also have your fund, you can pause and restart grant funding with activities due to the public health emergency. So a lot of flexibility in part 7 there. Again, we see in part 8 waivers from prior approval requirements, so long as consistent with other areas of federal law. Again, the exemption of certain procurement requirements with the geographic regions, minority businesses, women's owned business enterprises, and labor business area firms, or surplus area firms, excuse me. We see extension of financial and other reporting for a period of up to 3 months, where you can continue to draw down the grant dollars as again provided in the previous memoranda. The other thing that's kind of interesting too to note is that awarding agencies may allow grantees to continue to use the currently approved indirect cost rates, predetermined fixed or provisional rates to recover the indirect cost on federal awards. Agencies may approve grantee requests for an extension on the use of the current rates for 1 additional year without submission of a new indirect cost proposal. And agencies may also approve grantee requests for an extension of the indirect cost rate proposal submission to finalize the current rates and establish future rates. So that's something that's new here, and additional flexibility. Extension of closeout. Also, awarding agencies may allow the grantee to delay the submission of any pending financial performance or other reports required by the terms of the award for the closeout expired projects, provided that you have appropriate notice to do so, but this delay may not exceed 1 year after the award expires, so you do have some ability there. And then we had also the extension of single audit submissions now through June 30th, extended 6 months beyond the due date, the other thing as well. Kind of shifting gears a little bit though, we're going to get into USDA. There are some specific steps that USDA has taken to provide COVID relief. I know this font's a little small, but I'll go ahead and read through it and kind of go through some of the details that we've seen here. A lot of the meat of these programs has really been in 3 agencies, Rural Development, Risk Management Agency, and the Farm Service Agency. The first thing that we see is until September 30th, lenders of these loans may offer a 186-month or approximately 6-month there loan payment deferrals without getting prior agency approval. So these are with the USDA rural development backed loans for business and industry loan guarantees, for rural energy for the America program guarantees, community facility loan guarantees, and waste and water disposal loan guarantees. Another thing that we see, something that would kind of impacts our stakeholders quite a bit, is a moratorium on single family direct and guaranteed loan recipient foreclosures and eviction for a period of 60 days following 3/19/2020. So if you have a USDA backed rural housing loan, either provided by an intermediary lender or directly from the agency, there's a moratorium of 60 days on that eviction. Guaranteed loan recipients may have payments reduced or suspended. So if you have an intermediary loan kind of coming through there, and you have 12 months if you're facing a default or an imminent default due to a documented hardship, you may have a payment reduced or suspended for a 12-month period following that. The next thing we're going to get into is the risk management agency dealing with a lot of the crop insurance pieces of this. So if you have, there's kind of a lot of different things going on here. You may have additional time from an authorized insurance provider to provide additional time to make premium payment or administrative fees. Interest accrual on premium payments and administrative fees will be waived to the earliest of an additional 60 days from the scheduled payment due date or the termination date on policies with premium billing dates between March 1st, 2020 and April 30, 2020. AIPs are also authorized to allow additional time for policyholders to make a payment with written payment agreements due between March 1st, 2020 and April 30, 2020. Payments may be extended for 60 days from the scheduled payment due date and considered a timely payment. So there's a lot of different mechanics going on here with crop insurance. Producers may also send electronic notifications and reports for the 2020 crop year. Approved insurance providers may accept production reports through the earlier of the acreage reporting date or 30 days after the production reporting date for crops insured under the the Common Crop Insurance Policy Basic Provisions with a PRD of March 30, 2020 or March 15, 2020 or later. Again, with USDA Farm Service Agency, they're extending the deadline for applicants to complete farm loan applications. For direct loans, extending producer deadlines to respond to agency loan servicing actions, including loan deferral consolidation for financially distressed and delinquent borrowers. We're seeing a temporary suspension of loan foreclosures and different loan accelerations, non-judicial foreclosures, and referring foreclosures to the DOJ. One thing to note here is that the U.S. Attorney's Office, for those referrals that are already in their hands, the U.S. Attorney's Office will make the determination whether to stop foreclosures and evictions on accounts under its jurisdiction. The next part is for guaranteed loans. Guaranteed lenders can certify providing their borrowers with subsequent year operating loan advances on lines of credit and emergency advances on lines of credit. The Farm Service Agency will consider guaranteed lender requests for temporary payment deferral consideration when borrowers do not have a feasible plan, reflecting that family living expenses, operating expenses, and debt can be repaid, and temporary forbearance for borrowers on loan liquidation and foreclosure actions. So this is a lot of the relief that we're seeing. And another piece is that with the USDA Agricultural Marketing Service, we're seeing an extension of expiration dates for GAP, Domestic Origin Certification, and Plant Systems Audit Program certifications, a 60-day temporary extension for those scheduled to expire on or before May 31st this year. And with that, that's a little bit of these things. The next slide details the links on where a lot of this information is housed at. And it also is a good place if there's new information released that is kind of published on these clearinghouse websites. The House Agriculture Committee has a clearinghouse for all things COVID related, and all the press releases on the Senate Agriculture Committee are featured in the newsroom. So that's where a lot of this information comes from, and will continue to be updated throughout the process of different relief efforts taking place.
Great, thank you very much, Blake. As you all can see, a lot of detail and depth for different resources that are available for producers and folks that have access or are using programs like USDA. A lot of information available there. So all the information that Blake went through will be available and be shared out, so you have access to that as well. One of the next things that we'd like to be able to go into and take a look at is the sort of the efforts that are going to be happening for the COVID-19 bill number 4 and some of the things that we're hearing and want to be able to get some additional thoughts on as well. So with that, I'd like to have Carly Hotbed, our Director of Tribal Enterprise, join us to talk about some of the different things and information that she's been hearing and collecting, and then also to start off on our listening session. So Carly, please take it away.
Great, thank you, Colby. Othionagata, everybody. My name is Carly Hotbed, and as Colby said, I am the Director of Tribal Enterprise with Indigenous Food and Ag Initiative. I'm excited to be able to share with you kind of a forward-looking discussion about some opportunities that are going to be hopefully included and implemented in the COVID response bills as we move forward. So this next set of slides is going to go over some of those topics, but also at this point I wanted to ask you to please start thinking about the needs of your tribes or your operation, as we'll be soliciting feedback through a listening session at the end of this section. So start taking notes. If you see anything that we discuss or want more information on, that would be a good time to ask. Your input is incredibly valuable and necessary as we provide this support to stakeholders in Indian country through our legal analysis, policy research, and educational resources that we promote to improve health, economic well-being, and preservation of the cultural food traditions in Indian country. So as a part of our regular work in tribal ag and food and natural resource policy and outreach, we regularly receive feedback and questions from our stakeholders in Indian country, and we've compiled these slides with suggestions and requests for the stimulus relief as we go forward. So we visited with producers, economists, legal teams, tribal representatives, and other entities working in the space of tribal food, ag, and natural resources. And the ideas that have been discussed for potential to be included in future stimulus relief packages have fallen into 4 categories roughly. And those include food and nutrition, ag production and credit access, food systems and infrastructure, and ag and natural resource specific emergency management planning. So we've had a lot of partners in this, and so we're going to provide this to you for review. Some of these suggestions are new, some are edits or amendments to currently existing programs, and some of them are components that were existing in the Regaining Our Future report that weren't necessarily incorporated into the Farm Bill into the 2018 iteration. So we have some good opportunities moving forward to have our USDA ag programs more tribally inclusive. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so the food and nutrition components for bill number 4 and or number 5 that have been discussed include, as Aaron had discussed pretty in depth about some of the FDPIR programmatic opportunities that were coming through, but also looking for FDPIR COVID-19 funding to be used as an administrative cost and include that waiver of the non-federal cost share requirement, allowing tribes to be a little bit more nimble when it comes to, ITOs to be a little more nimble when it comes to responding to the needs of tribal populations when it comes to the FDPIR program. We're also looking at opportunities for local and regional food procurement through additional FDPIR funding, and I think that's going to be really vital. We had heard some issues about supply chain disruption and allowing these FDPIR programs to source local and regional food kind of helps stabilize that food supply system, and also provide some incentive for our local and tribal producers to have some additional economic opportunities when we're seeing a real constraint on the market right now. We'd like to see tribal inclusion in TFAP and money for FDPIR equipment. There's been some allocation, but we want to make sure that those dollars are going to be able to really address the needs of what we're seeing right now, especially when people are having to self-quarantine at home and practice social distancing. So some additional community outreach would be necessary. And we see that through the potential of refrigerated delivery vans and other types of more direct connection with the households that are being served under the FDPIR program. We also see some money for infrastructure improvement to allow drive-through food pickup. That's currently occurring in a limited circumstance, but with the social distancing protocols that are in place, it helps to be conscious of some of the limitations that the infrastructure currently has, and whether that's setting up a drive-through process or whether it's a tent rental so that people don't have to come into the store, whatever that looks like, there needs to be some flexibility to be able to be responsive to each individual ITO's operation when it comes to FDPIR programs and how they're serving the needs of their people. We've also discussed some consideration for authorizing warehouse storage use to store supplemental non-FDPIR food products. As we discussed, that food chain disruption is something that is of concern to everybody. And if there's an opportunity for tribes to supplement some of these missing components of the food package, it may make it easier to get those goods and products to the recipients of the FDPIR program. So looking at some flexibility there. Next slide, please. All right, the next category is ag production and credit access. And you heard Blake talk quite a bit about some of the FSA opportunities that have come through with regard to delay payments and whatnot. But we're also looking for some more in-depth opportunity when it comes to that. We have collaborated quite a bit, and a lot of these ideas came through after discussions with Zach Ducheneau, who's the Executive Director of Intertribal Ag Council that we work very closely with. And I'm very excited to be able to continue that partnership in order to help everybody in Indian country when it comes to overcoming the crisis that we're seeing with COVID-19. But one of the things we're looking at is possibly considering authorization for FSA to exercise disaster provisions to set aside payments temporarily. And Blake had talked a little bit about that. We'd like to see more robust components come through there. A waiver of the graduation requirements for FSA. And that's something that we had discussed previously when it comes to inclusion in the Farm Bill for things that we were looking at. Right now, there's a requirement that the graduation, you have to get rejection letters or applications through other entities before being eligible for certain FSA components. And we'd like to alleviate that, especially considering the limitation of availability of those opportunities in Indian country in the first place. So that's something that we're considering. We also want to include grants in emergency and disaster funding that aren't required to be repaid, just direct dollar injections to help people keep their operations going and alleviate some of the challenges that are coming with that constrained economy that we're seeing right now. Additional CDFI loan funding for disaster emergency recovery and tribal agriculture, getting those dollars more directly accessible to tribal lands and tribal producers in tribal areas is hopefully going to be better than having to deal with some of the administrative red tape that comes with other types of loan programs that aren't as nimble as CDFIs that we see. There's also consideration for deferring FSA loan payments due, whether that's a principal deferral or whether that's a complete deferral for principal and interest, with or without interest accruing during that time. Kind of similar to what we're seeing with student loan payments right now, and that's federal student loan payments. They're suspended currently, principal and interest until September 30th. So there's already precedent for something like that to happen, so that may be an option as well. We want to change the maximum operating loan term to 10 years. That'll give us some additional interest in investing in Indian country. And then zero interest on operating loans that are closing or that were applied for in 2020, and then loans this previous year, 1.5% interest that we see for that. And so also opportunities to create a multi-generational mortgage, which would be interesting for Indian country because it kind of would allow to address the land tenure challenges that we're seeing when it comes to transferring land from one generation to another. So there may be some additional estate planning opportunities available with that come along and kind of mitigate some of those issues when it comes to getting that land transferred and planning for long-term use. We want to see more funding for FSA loans, and also allow farm ownership loans to be used for refinance of guaranteed or other real estate loans. So that kind of allows an opportunity for distressed loans that were guaranteed or for other real estate loans, the opportunity to kind of come in and alleviate some of the challenges associated with that. In FSA guaranteed lending, offering interest assist directly to banks on all existing or new loans, and having a max rate for a 3-year CD at that rate plus 2% on all new or restructured guarantees. Now, when we talk about some of the opportunities for FSA and credit access, we consider a $50 million appropriation for a new loan guarantee authority to stimulate some of those economic investments that we want to see in Indian country, and also help establish and support food systems local to tribal communities. The other component that we were discussing is, we actually go back to the previous slide, please. The ag and production and credit access slide. Yeah, there you go. We're talking about the discussion about the differences between whether it's more beneficial to defer a loan or whether loan forgiveness is something that should be considered. Now, for a deferral, there's no new spending, so there is not necessarily as big of a financial burden for Congress to consider. And if it's deferred at current interest rates, it's generally better for the taxpayer. And if that interest is paid annually, then it'll improve the equity position of the person that's receiving the note. The pros of debt forgiveness, there's a huge equity boost to producers. I mean, and you're able to alleviate, your debt ratios, and it offers a reset to that 4% per year increase that we've been seeing in farm debt since 1994. And we have a total, as of 2019, of $426 billion farm debt that we see in agriculture. So alleviating that debt could become the catalyst that would recreate ag practices, keeping an eye towards sustainable or regenerative agriculture, and eliminate the need for subsidy payments in certain areas. The opportunity costs or the sunk costs that currently exist to maintain the current operations under that debt burden to make sure that there's enough cash flow to meet the payments associated with that could be alleviated through that debt forgiveness. And then when producers are looking forward as far as how they can improve their operation, consider that as a risk mitigation that encourages that innovation and investment for new or different practices that are maybe more conservation oriented or more responsive to market demand or more in line with possible ag resource management plans that are implemented at the tribal level. And then the cons of either program that we kind of see is, people are really concerned about government becoming involved in agriculture. But when we see things like the current status of the beef market and supply chain challenges that are going on, that's something that is worth discussing. It's also important to point out that the United States has one of the most heavily subsidized food systems globally, but we also pay the lowest the lowest percentage of our salaries on food. Now, in Indian country, that's usually a greater percentage than what we would see in other areas. However, subsidized agriculture systems across the board are not something that is new for the United States, and it isn't something that's going to be a surprise coming forward. So there's already precedent for the types of programs and activities that we're talking about. Next slide. All right, so in food systems and infrastructure, some of the things that were reported to us were a request to fix the value-added producer grant program, to add a section ensuring that all tribal government or tribal community-owned food businesses are fully authorized to use that. So that's an example of a barrier to access removal that we're seeking. $30 million into the FDPIR Tribal Extension Program, which would allow the deployment of additional resources to those 1862 and 1994 land grant institutions to help hire additional staff to rebuild that resiliency and get that technical support for ag production and community food resiliency out to those tribal communities. That additional injection of funding will also be beneficial because it's been pretty flat, but there's been additional universities that have come online. So there's additional competition for that pot of money that's kind of been spread a little thin. So another $30 million would be really helpful to kind of even out the opportunity for these land grant institutions to expand their FDPIR programs. We'd also like to seek funding to hire regional tribal liaisons for NRCS. Again, that's similar to that FDPIR organization, allowing a little bit more direct deployment of some of the opportunities available in that technical support there in NRCS as well. We want to include cattle and bison or livestock in the MFP program. And in the local food and farmers market program, a $25 million is set aside specifically for tribal producers. Again, this is another component that would really help develop that local tribal food economy and support some of those small to mid-scale producers to get their operations scaled up to where they want to be as far as being able to be a resource to the community and feed people in the area. Emergency water infrastructure funding for underserved tribal areas. This one was something that kind of came up through a discussion after seeing the challenges that Navajo Nation is currently having with the COVID-19 response. And there's a lot of different factors that are influencing the results of why that impact is being seen so much harder in that area. But a component of that is that there's a lack of water and electric infrastructure to a good chunk of the reservation area. Up to a third is lacking in water infrastructure, and whether that emergency water infrastructure funding, whether that's actual pipelines dug or water buffaloes that are made available to certain areas, there's some flexibility in that, and it's important for us to receive feedback from tribes to hear what those needs actually are, so we know that what asks are being put forth or being shared for educational purposes is accurate and actually depicts the needs of the tribal area that we're talking about. And then we'd also like to see a fully funding of the USDA Office of Tribal Relations for maximum outreach. Again, this is in line with the ask for the FDPIR Tribal Extension Program and also for regional tribal agents for NRCS, just to make sure that that contact is available and that tribes and tribal producers and tribal entities are being made aware of the opportunities and collaborating with USDA staff to have a maximum outreach and maximum opportunity to implement those programs. Next slide. All right, and the last category that we're talking about is emergency management planning. Especially now that we're experiencing this type of emergency management, there's no better time to talk about what's going on right now with regard to ag and natural resource specific emergency planning. So FEMA currently offers emergency management training courses that are targeted towards tribal government for tribal leaders, tribal employees. I myself have taken the emergency management framework for tribal governments, and FEMA will come on site to your tribal location and train your people there. One of the things that I think is kind of an opportunity for FEMA to be able to step in and address some of the challenges that we see in emergency management response is to provide training for tribal governments and tribal producers specifically regarding tribal agriculture and natural resource management. Now we know that there's a variety of hazardous conditions that arise that would be considered, our response to them would be considered emergency management, but a lot of times it's not something that we think about in advance as far as how to address that. So we also request funding to assist tribal producers in developing individual emergency management plans for their local tribal agriculture enterprises and operations. And those plans could include responses to pandemics like we're seeing right now, possible bioterrorism, a new onslaught of invasive species, weather hazards like we've seen on Cheyenne River with the flooding hazards that we have. A lot of tribes here in Oklahoma deal with tornadoes, earthquakes, fire has been particularly pervasive. And how are you dealing with your crop management? How are you dealing with your livestock or your animals that are on site? What kind of response do you need to have? Who are you supposed to coordinate with? How do you respond to certain chemical hazards like spills or seeps or airborne releases? And what are they doing to impact your production operation, your value-added operation, or your retail operations or sites? So that's something that we want tribal governments and tribal entities to be better prepared for, and are requesting FEMA's support in making that happen as we move forward. Next slide, please. Great. All right, so now we've come to the listening session component for this COVID response. We want to hear from you. What concerns or issues are you all experiencing or seeing? Are there programs in place that you feel like could better serve tribal communities? If there were some changes or tweaks that would better fit or address some of the challenges that you all are having accessing them? Do you have other suggestions for us that we can include in the list that we're putting together? And we also want to hear what your tribe is currently doing to address some of the challenges with COVID-19. We know that there are feeding programs in place. There's additional support for direct, food distribution on site, in addition to maybe some economic bonuses that are coming through as far as direct payments are concerned. But we'd like to open it up now and hear from you. We'll be taking notes, answering questions, and hopefully getting a more robust package put together so we understand exactly what it is that you're looking for. And I'll turn it back over.
Great. Thank you so much, Carly, for all the detailed information, and thank you to all of our stakeholders and partners and friends for all the information that you've provided so far. Obviously, there's a lot that's a possibility to do, but we know that's not encompassing of all the different concerns and needs that folks are seeing. So to be able to participate in this listening session, you can raise your hand by pressing the little hand icon on the control panel, and we can unmute your microphone. If you don't want to do that, we can also you can also type your question into the question box, and we can answer them from there. We do have, I see a person with one hand up already, so please be sure to make sure to do those. And it looks like, oops, I scrolled past it. It looks like it is Michael Chavarria. And Michael, you need to hopefully dial in with audio so we can try to make your microphone live as well. Whitney or Nikki, do we have any other folks that have their hands up?
I'm not seeing anybody else at this time.
Okay, great. We'll go through some of the questions that are in the chat box. Those folks
wait.
are,
I've got Deborah.
oh, Deb Lenkanoff.
Yeah. I have her unmuted.
Okay.
She can go ahead with her question.
Hi, Deborah, are you there? You have a question or comment?
Hi, can you hear me now, Colby?
Yes, we can.
Oh, good, great. Thank you for the great presentation today. It was well put together, very precise. Coming from Washington State and being in the epicenter of the coronavirus, we've seen at a state level how we were moving, we'd wished we'd moved a little bit faster in preparing our communities for what they're facing. The needs for broadband and education to move quicker, the needs for supplies. We know we don't have enough tests. We're not moving our tests fast enough. We also don't have the PPEs that we need. When you're looking into this next phase of the bills coming through, Colby, is there a survey or is there a process in which tribes on a national basis can really look at the geographical areas where there are hotspots and prioritize back from there? One, we know the tribes in Washington State, Lummi Nation, just to the north of us, there are over 2,000 cases to the south of them. There's almost 1,000 cases to the north of them across the border. We know Tulalip is just sitting right up against King County, where there's 2,000 cases. It's just a matter of time. How do we best, in the first question, prepare information concisely by state maybe, or by territory, in correlation with tribes to get them better prepared? And then secondly, is there a template or a model of a way of how we feed that back to organizational structures such as your guys's, which is helping build our story? Thanks, Colby.
Sure, thank you so much for that question. Deb, we really appreciate that, and know all the different difficulties that are going on in the state of Washington and with all the different tribal governments there. So I think to answer the first question regarding some of the different the impacts and access to resources, I know that there are a lot of folks, particularly the National Indian Health Board and National Council for Indian Urban Health that are looking at trying to be able to, to do things to be able to prioritize the funding that is now available at CDC and also available through IHS to get that out the door. I think those processes are ongoing now. But we do have some links that are included on some of the earlier slides that provide information to that. So those might be helpful. But we'd be glad to be able to direct you directly to them and direct any folks directly to those folks that have concerns about being able to access resources to ensure that that they're able to get those and to be able to be included in that process, particularly as that I think with a lot of the newer components that are coming out within the CARES bill, agencies are just starting to think about those processes and how to move those along. So I think having everybody's voice at the table regarding those is incredibly important to ensure that the folks that are seeing the long-standing impact and some of the first impacts of the COVID-19 crisis are getting access to that. As far as being able to get additional input, I know that some of the other national organizations are soliciting input. I don't think that they have a particular forum to do that, and we're glad to put forward any of the information that we hear through the Native Farm Bill Coalition to do that. We're also looking at doing some additional surveys and information as well to kind of collect that and collect stories. That's some of the work that we've been doing with the National Association of FDPIR to collect some of the impacts of that. And as you said, Deb, I know it's incredibly important to collect stories and collect that information. So anything that can be forwarded or sent to us, we'll also have a contact slide that will have the email of every single member of our staff. So you can send any information forward to us throughout this process. And so we'd be glad to uplift that and send that forward and to be able to put it forward in some of the work that we're doing if that works as well. So thank you with that. Okay, the next hand we have up is Michael Chavarria. And Mr. Chavarria, you should be unmuted now. Okay, hello? Mr. Chavarria, are you there? Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, sorry, I was on both the landline and the computer, so I turned off my phone at this time because I was getting that alien sound.
No problem. We can hear you loud and clear now.
Okay. No, thank you for putting this call together. My name is Michael Chavarria, and I serve as the governor for Santa Clara Pueblo here in New Mexico, and I also serve as the chairman for the All Pueblo Council of Governors of the 19 pueblos here in New Mexico. So thank you for putting this call together. I know as tribal leaders have been on various calls as it relates to this new legislation, the CARES Act. And so I was trying to keep in touch. I appreciate the slides that were provided, but can I ask for the specifics of each bullet? I know there was like more discussion and I couldn't type fast enough to jot everything down because there was a lot of information that were specifically, how would you say that went with each bulleted topic?
Sure, we're looking for additional information regarding each of the bullet points. We're glad to send out more. I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, I know the speakers are talking about various things, but like I said, I was having a hard time keeping up on that. So that's the first question. I also see the food distribution program, $100 million. I know through the 8 northern pueblos here in New Mexico, we do provide that FDPIR program. So I want to make sure that we support that initiative. I had a question regarding the nutrition program. And I don't know if this is through this one, but what mechanism or agency will be responsible for that $8 million child nutrition program? And how will the funds be allocated? And is there an intended purpose for that?
Yes, I think I'll take those in a reverse order. For the $8 million for child nutrition programs, it's a larger set of programs that include support for school lunch programs, aftercare programs, and also the summer feeding programs. And so we'll be happy to get you some additional information. One thing we have that we'll be showing at the end of this webinar is a link and resource to our website, which has some specific information, particularly on being able to access funding and programs related to child nutrition programming as well. So there is some additional information for this. Regarding some of the information, we are recording this webinar, so we'll be making that available to everybody so that that information is out there. And if there are particular things, we'd be glad to provide additional information specifically to you to help to clarify and add additional kind of meat to some of the bullet points that we have in there.
Okay, and then the next question was the 9.5 million, I think was mentioned on the livestock growers. I guess what is going to be that funding mechanism? Is there a guidance? Is it going to be a grant? Is it going to be a 638 contract? How is that mechanism going to be provided directly to those type of individuals?
It's a good question. It'll be that money will come through some of the disaster programming, which producers will have specific access to through the agency at USDA that is in charge of those disaster programming. And that link and information, we'll be sure to send that to you and highlight that to you. I think is included on the link that's on one of Blake's slides regarding some of the different resources at USDA that covers disaster assistance.
Okay, and then I guess the last question, or wait, I know it was mentioned earlier through the new Farm Bill provisions with the 638 for USDA Forest Service. Can you also provide some information on Forest Service opportunities? For Santa Clara, we've been using the Tribal Forest Protection Act to do co-management type of activities on Forest Service lands, but I'm not too sure what provisions or specifics are tied into that type of opportunity.
Yes, so I'm not sure where USDA's Forest Service implementation is of that 638 provision. I do know that in some of the COVID bills that have gone forward, have provided some funding and support for management and other management and protection for folks that are working in the National Forest System and at Forest Service that are doing forest management and protection at this time. So that might be some additional information and support that might be accessed by Santa Clara Pueblo and some of the work that you all are doing with that as well. So that might be an additional resource.
So would that question be better posed to Chief Christensen and the Forest Service?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And then the last one, I guess, is being that all tribes, pueblos, and nations are in a financial hardship, being that most of our economic development ventures are closed. I've been pushing for cost match waivers for the various grant or funding opportunities across all federal agency levels. So all of us are in a financial hardship because our development, tribally owned businesses are closed off, and so we're not getting no revenue, tax base. And so I don't know if that's a question for this or if I have to push that through our congressional delegation to make that across the board cost match waiver for any potential grants. I just don't want the Pueblos, tribes, and nations to miss out, especially with an extra burden, financial hardship basis on that.
That's an excellent point. I know that's something that's been pushed for in some other areas, and that was one of the things that was included in the ideas and asks for the FDPIR program, as that requires a cost share and match. So I think the answer to your question is both. We'd be glad to include that information that we send forward to the Native Farm Bill Coalition. And I would also, recommend that you send that information to your congressional delegation as well, too, as they're looking to implement some of the additional legislative packages that are going forward.
But again, thank you for taking my call. I know there's a lot of questions. Is there a website that I can submit additional questions to?
Sure. You can send them to our website, indigenousfoodandag.org. We'll also have our contact information up for our team, so you can also email them directly to us as well. Maybe be glad to answer those as they come in, Governor. But thank you for your kind words and for all your work. We really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you. And power of prayer will get us all through this. So I appreciate all of your efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, do we have any additional folks with their hands up?
Yes, I've got Raymond Concho. Raymond, whenever you're ready, you're unmuted and you can go ahead with your question.
Raymond, are you there? Can you hear us? Maybe he's having some microphone issues. We can go back. As I think that might be the only other hand up. Can we go to maybe some of the questions that we have in the chat box? So one of the questions that we've got from a couple of different folks is regarding a temporary or permanent change that doesn't allow for the use of both SNAP and FDPIR at the same time. As folks know, those are seen as two separate programs, and participants cannot use those simultaneously. I know that is something that has been discussed and has come up before. I don't know if Aaron or other folks want to chat a little bit more about that.
Sure. This is Erin. I can talk about that a little bit. Yeah, I think I said that very, very briefly when I went through the FDPIR update, but as Colby just mentioned, those are two programs that are mutually exclusive right now. If you qualify for both of them, you can't use SNAP and FDPIR in the same month. That is actually that is in the authorizing legislation that originally created FDPIR in 1977. So that would require a change in the law. I don't know if that's something that USDA could necessarily do long-term through some kind of administrative flexibility, but that I know that idea has been discussed. I know like both members of NAFDPIR and other stakeholders as well have brought that forward. I don't know, Colby, you have any more information to share about that, but that is, that's where that comes from. It is in the statute itself that actually created the food distribution program.
Absolutely, and it's been something that's been considered, and I know it's been put forward before in some of the responses. I think one thing that's important to see that, being able to, particularly at least within an emergency in a temporary scenario, is something that we've heard would be incredibly helpful to allow folks to be able to have additional support to go purchase items that they need at stores, and also to have access to the items that the FDPIR program provides. So I think that's something that will be probably put forward by some folks in the coming bills or so. We know that the fourth bill will have some additional looks at nutrition, particularly with SNAP and the request from a lot of the anti-hunger organizations to increase the amount of funding SNAP has to address the inevitable increases that program is going to be able to see. Some of the other questions that we have, one idea that came forward from, and this is from Jerry Pardilla at USAT, and ideas for the C4 bills provide financial assistance to tribal nations and TA providers to obtain emergency support to maintain continuity of operations. A lot of tribal nations and tribal organizations help support water and wastewater systems and operations. So I think that's an excellent suggestion. Jerry will make sure to include that going forward. One question that came forward is about the regional tribal liaisons for NRCS and asking about how many and where they would be hired. I don't know if we, Carly, do you have any additional thoughts regarding that?
Yeah, I think in some of the discussions that we had with the Tribal Conservation Advisory Councils, a plan was floated to include 3 regional tribal liaisons kind of responsive to the areas where the committees were located. So that was Western, Central, and Eastern, as far as that's kind of broken up generically. But there's some flexibility if there's feedback as far as how many to include, where they need to be organized at. And kind of provide some additional support for the regional administrators at NRCS to provide a better connection from a tribal community perspective and really get that information flowing between USDA staff and tribes to be responsive as far as some of the nuances are concerned for tribal conservation challenges, and getting that information up the chain and then flow back down for a product that's going to be applicable for these tribes as we move forward. So the discussion was 3, but that's flexible. And if there's additional feedback that anybody wants to provide, we're happy to hear it and share that with our partners.
Great, thank you, Carly. One question came through about folks that operate a food pantry working with the tribe that aren't participants under FDPIR. We know a lot of folks throughout tribal communities access food pantries as well. There is additional funding and support for that food assistance and food pantry systems in the CARES Act and in some of the subsequent legislation. So there should be some additional dollars in there. I would encourage you to take a look at the different organizations and entities that you work with currently to be able to see what opportunities exist to be able to access that as well. And we can try to put forward some more information on that. Another question is, are tribes able to use any of the funds under any of the bills to purchase food directly for tribal members? I don't think that's included in any of the bills. We know that was an ask of being able to have the FDPIR sites to purchase foods directly, and something that's been asked for in the implementation. But I think that's a good idea that looking at trying to be able to empower tribes to have the ability to be able to provide as much food to their citizens as possible is important as well. So I think that's a good suggestion, and we'll put that forward. One question we got about how to provide access to emergency water infrastructure funding, providing a little bit more information and clarity on being able to access that. I don't know, Carly, if you wanted to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that's just one of the requests that have come through as far as how that would be administered and what that would come through. I know there's under some current iterations, there's been some dollars set aside for utility consideration, and this one would be specifically targeting emergency management. It's really flexible right now as far as what the ask is going to look like, whether it needs to be something that's like a longer term infrastructure development, or whether it's targeted towards meeting immediate needs for areas that are lacking that infrastructure, remains something that needs to be discussed. And I think something that's important to consider is when we share this information with our partners that are going to be taking that to lobby Congress and visit with their elected officials to get that information put in, it's a discussion point, and how that needs to be fleshed out is something that can be a collaborative effort. So there's some different ways to do that, how to access that funding since it hasn't been included in a bill. That's not something that we could speak to at this point, but that's something that was considered, especially we have a lot of these tribal communities that are, as we heard, immediately adjacent to hotspots or hotspots themselves. any way that we can receive feedback on how to correct that, and that the access to water infrastructure was one of the ones that we had heard.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Carly. We just had someone asking for more information about the 638 contract provision. I imagine that particularly with USDA's Food Nutrition Service. Aaron, do you want to go talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So the 2018 Farm Bill had a couple of really exciting opportunities applying the 638 self-governance authority to USDA programs for the very first time. It implied those in two places. Governor Chavarria spoke earlier, mentioned the Forest Service provision. That was one of them, but the other one was in the nutrition program, specifically creating a demonstration project for FDPIR, whereby tribal nations or ITOs would be able to purchase food directly for that program. There's some guidelines in the Farm Bill, very minimal guidelines in the Farm Bill for what that would need to look like. The food basically just, it has to be domestically purchased. It has to be grown rather, it has to be purchased like from growers here in the United States or producers here in the United States. It has to be of an equivalent nutritional value, and it needs to be replacing a food in the food package. Right now, it can't be an additional food. It needs to like take a food out of the food package and put that food that the local ITO or tribal nation is purchasing back in there. But there aren't that many restrictions on it. And what USDA was trying to do right before all of this happened was open up that application process and put together what that application process would actually look like. The 638 authority is brand new to USDA. They've never really had a pass at it before. So I think they were doing a lot of looking into BIA and IHS as to how that might work for them under this new authority that the Farm Bill had created. And that authority, by the way, came through the Native Farm Bill Coalition's, I think, work and requests. All of the member tribes that are in the Native Farm Bill Coalition like recognizing the extraordinary importance of recognizing tribal sovereignty in that way in the Farm Bill, and all the partner organizations in the to the Native Farm Bill Coalition that were working on that as well. So that's kind of where that came from. There is $3 million that has been appropriated for it, and that does need to be spent before September 30th, 2021, I believe is when those funds expire. So one of the implementation requests that went in that letter to USDA from the Native Farm Bill Coalition and other stakeholders that Colby mentioned, that's in your handouts section there, discusses that as a priority to be able to get that money out as soon as possible, open up that application process now so that tribal nations have the opportunity through that existing authority and funding to buy local goods. A lot of the goods that have been identified by ITOs and by NAFDPIR as being things that ITOs would really want to source right now through that have been things like fresh fruits and vegetables, like traditional foods that are grown or processed or raised locally by tribal growers, by tribal livestock folks, tribal fishermen, to be able to put some money into the local economy immediately right now to those tribal growers and producers and ranchers, and also be able to support FDPIR at the same time. So I hope that helps a little bit. We've got a lot of more information about FDPIR and 638 on our website. It's indigenousfoodandag.com, and I know it's definitely linked here in the materials and the slides. That's all in the resources section of our website, or please feel free to reach out to me. I've got a ton more information that I can send forward, and including some comments that the Native Farm Bill Coalition template created specifically for that process to send comments to USDA. So I can send that along as well. So happy to share more info. I hope that helps.
Oh, apologize. I was just going here answering questions and I was on mute. Thank you to my team for texting and letting me know that I was just chatting away here to nobody but myself. So we have several more questions. We have this scheduled for 90 minutes and we've definitely gone over. I know we have a good number of folks on, so we're still able to glad to be able to answer as many questions as we can. We have some folks looking up stuff as well that have come through there. One question we have is about tribal inclusion for TFAP. I think that is one that is an important one that was put forward in both the C3 bill and will probably put forward for C4. I think just probably briefly, that would look just like the process that a state goes through to access and develop a plan for emergency food assistance programs, to be able to develop that plan out, to be able to access the funding, to kind of follow along that type of process for it. And I think as we're kind of in that space right now, looking at ways to provide out as much emergency food, particularly into rural areas and tribal communities, is an important thing as well. I don't know if folks want to add any more information regarding that as well. Some concerns that were put forward by Trent Egerstrom from the University of Arizona. Just want to read some of these, so we have these kind of on the record. Is immediate relief from grazing and other leases and irrigation fees. There's a lot of fast track loans through FDA, which take about 6 months, and so which has zero low interest to get those in place for the fall, for the winter. Looking for price supports for hay and cattle, which is something that Carly talked about. What to do with food supplies running low. No access to intensive care units on IHS clinics, and sometimes it can be up to 200 miles away to a hospital with an ICU. And also what to do when you have family ties and folks in homes that are sick and have to be self-isolating, and how to care for, ensure that the folks don't spread if they have COVID to their family as well. It's all important points. Another question is there funding to ensure child nutrition programs are adequately compensated for unexpected losses in the spring semester? I think that's a good question. A lot of the funding that's come through for those child nutrition programs are to help provide food services for that. I think they are looking at ways to make sure that there aren't particular losses, and also ways to be able to access food as well for it. So I think some of the different funding will be able to support that. One question that we have from the second Lieutenant Governor from the Pueblo of Laguna is any idea how suppliers will get food out to their clients under the FDPIR program, knowing that some areas are seeing shortages, and this will be a problem going forward. I know they've had some discussions with some of the drivers, and issues of being able to travel both within a state and then out of state as well. Aaron, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about some of those conversations.
Sure. That's a really good question, Lieutenant Governor, and thank you for raising that. I know NAFDPIR has specifically addressed that with USDA FNS recently, trying to work with FNS to make sure that FNS is getting guidance out to all of the regional offices and trying to reach out through their channels to both of the national warehouses that store food that USDA manages, as well as working with the Department of Defense, Defense Logistics Agency that does all of the fresh produce for FDPIR, to make sure that all of those folks get word out to their drivers that they need to reach out to their ITOs that they're serving right now to see if there are specific protocols or restrictions that they may have on getting food out to the warehouses right now, because we know a lot of pueblos and tribal nations right now are putting restrictions on entrance into their jurisdictions to be able to try to slow the spread of the virus and keep people healthy. So we know a lot of the FDPIR ITOs are having similar protocols and restrictions in place right now as well. They're changing the way that they receive deliveries. Their drivers may not be able to back up to a loading dock anymore. They're asking people to check in at the front door, for example, instead of actually physically coming into the facility. So NAFDPIR has definitely raised that with FNS, and we're going to be following up with FNS to make sure that they can can get that guidance out to all of the warehouse folks so that they can get it to the drivers as well, and make sure that they're directly reaching out to the ITO, because we know the protocols and procedures are going to be different at every single ITO across the country right now. So I thank you for raising that, and we'll continue to make sure that we elevate that to USDA as well.
Thank you very much, Aaron. One question that we had come through, and I'll open this up to the folks in our team, particularly looking at being able to support, grants and loans that cover greenhouses. These are things that might be important that folks look into. Are there grants and loan programs that folks can access now that can help build that type of infrastructure?
This is Carly. I know NRCS through some, I think, EQIP opportunities was offering like high tunnel or hoop house setups as far as like self-contained greenhouses. Then maybe more of a general like FSA loan or something of that nature that people could explore for their own enterprise that they were looking for.
Great, thank you, Carly. We also have some questions on USDA ARA loans that were used to do community centers under the 2009 America Recovery and Reinvestment Act, and asking if the debt on that can be forgiven. I don't think that's come through yet, but I think that might be something to look at as we're looking at some of the additional debt forgiveness that folks are looking for. So I think that's a really good suggestion that we're able to put forward as well. Additionally, I have a question regarding the broadband funding. Yes, there is broadband funding, particularly for the Reconnect program. If you look at the letter that was put forward by some of the tribal organizations, it asked specifically for a tribal priority to access that funding. It's not specifically in the C3 bill, but that money will be going out through rural development and the Rural Development Reconnect broadband program. I think they've actually put their application process on hold as it was supposed to end. So you can go to their website to be able to look at accessing the funding that's available through that program. And I think that process should be open pretty quickly. So I know that we're at about 2 hours or so. So we can be able to start to wrap this up. I know that we have gotten a lot of questions from folks, and we're glad to be able to answer some of these offline and to be able to send out some additional resources and information as we promised. So with that, I just want to say thank you very much to our entire team at IFAI for putting together all this information. Josiah, Aaron, Blake, Carly, Whitney, Nikki, and Brenton for all of their hard work on this. Thank you all to all of the folks who joined us for this and all of your information and questions and other components as well too. We're glad to be able to carry this forward, and we'll be looking to do more of these as well. And we're always available for additional input. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our Communications Director, Whitney Sunny, to talk about some of the resources that we have available at IFAI. Whitney.
Great, thank you, Colby. As Colby had mentioned, we will be updating all of this information on our website, which is indigenousfoodandag.com. We have a specific web page dedicated to some of the resources that were mentioned today. So in addition to the resources shared here and the handouts, as well as the presentation with the included links that everyone was referring to, as well as the webinar recording, because I know that there's additional information that was included as members of our team were speaking today. So you'll be able to reference that, and we'll do our best to include like a timestamp and a breakdown of when that information was shared throughout the webinar so that you don't have to scroll through the entire thing. We'll try to do our best to make that clear. Some other resources here are laid out that are on that webpage. Includes a breakdown of meal services in Indian country, different program flexibilities for food access from the USDA, the food safety resource that Josiah touched base on today with frequently asked questions and considerations for food safety amid COVID-19, as well as updates on FDPIR. We also have a resource bank of links to other Native organizations and their web pages dedicated to resources in response to COVID-19. On our website, we do have all of our contact information for every single one of our team members. So if you need to submit additional responses or questions, please feel free to reach out to our team. And we will also have a submission form to send over those questions as well.
Great, thank you so much, Whitney. You have all that information, resources, and all the website that was put together that has all the different things from today and that were mentioned on there as well. Here's also a slide that has all of the contact information for our entire team as well too. So please don't hesitate to reach out to any one of us regarding any questions or concerns that you have. We'd be glad to be able to answer any questions that come up. Again, thank you all of you so much for staying on here and for asking your questions and your input and providing all that information. We're glad to be able to put all of this forward as we can. Thank you to our team at IFAI. Thank you to our partner organizations, IAC, the folks at the Native Farm Bill Coalition, and all the folks that have been working on this effort as well. We know that we're all in this together and we all have such a strong, incredible community and network of support throughout this. And so we appreciate everything that you all are doing. Thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. And we look forward to talking to you on our subsequent webinars.